Hello everyone. In the previous video, I talked about a typical outline or a typical narrative for the review of literature of a mediation study. So for today, I will talk about a typical outline or narrative for a literature review of a moderation study. Before we continue, I'm inviting everyone to please subscribe to the channel. More than 90% of the people who are watching these lectures and tutorials are not subscribed, so I would really appreciate it if you can show your support by subscribing, especially if my lectures and tutorials has helped you somehow. Thank you very much. So let's begin by reviewing what moderation is. So in moderation, we are essentially testing a particular model wherein we're interested in the relationship of the IV and the DV. However, there is reason to believe that this relationship is inconsistent and that the relationship varies depending on the level of another variable, and that other variable is what we refer to as a moderator. So for this particular example, these are the variables that are involved. Hypothetically, there is a research that hypothesizes that social capital positively predicts pro-social behavior, but more specifically, this relationship is a function of having initiative, meaning to say that this relationship, social capital and pro-social behavior, is only true or is more true for people who have higher initiative. But for people who have lower initiative, this might not necessarily be true. So just to be clear, let's kind of define what these variables are, loosely defined. So when we say social capital, it refers to a set of shared values or resources that allows an individual to work together in a group to effectively achieve a common purpose. So one's social capital essentially can be operationalized as, let's say, for example, one's set of network, his resources based on the people that surrounds him. And then when we say pro-social behavior, basically we're referring to helping behaviors, so behaviors that benefit other people. And then, of course, when we say initiative, this means to say the quality of an individual, that which allows him to take action. So that loosely is what we are referring to when we say initiative. So just like in the previous video, there are two columns here. To your left is the generic outline, and then to your right would be a sample outline for a hypothetical paper. Again, this might feel like a script, this might feel like a template, but my intention here is not really to present a script. There really is no script or there really is no template for organizing your literature review, but this is just some kind of a suggestion. This is one way by which you can organize your thoughts and ideas in writing or in organizing your literature review. I've read a couple of moderation papers, and oftentimes I find that some of the things that I will suggest applies to many of them. So take what you can from this video. It can serve as some kind of an inspiration, or just for you to have some kind of an idea of how a researcher might think in terms of organizing ideas for the literature review. Okay. So the first one, it is typical for me to talk about the outcome variable as the starting point of my literature review. Oftentimes, students begin literature review by discussing the predictor variable, only because when we look at models, we see the predictor variable first. But personally, I think that it's better if you talk about your outcome variable first, because essentially this model attempts to explain the outcome variable. Therefore, the outcome variable, more often than not always, but more often than not, seems to be the most important thing or the centerpiece of a given paper. So what I would do is I would introduce the outcome variable and perhaps a bit of context, if context is very important for this particular research. I will define the outcome variable and I will explain the importance of the outcome variable. Normally, when we say explain the importance of the outcome variable, this can be done by showcasing what the outcome variable leads to. So what are the benefits of, let's say, for example, behaving pro-socially? Or what are the negative consequences of not behaving pro-socially? So that would be a way by which you can showcase the importance of pro-social behavior. So in the hypothetical paper, this section would probably be best described as the importance of pro-social behavior. So in the outline, I would introduce the idea of helping, particularly the concept of pro-social behavior. Pro-social behavior is a bit broad, so probably you can kind of discuss what are the different types of pro-social behavior. Is it unidimensional? Are there subdimensions, etc., etc.? And then define what pro-social behavior is. To what extent can a behavior be called pro-social? What it is not. Now, what are the parameters of pro-social behavior? And then explain the importance of pro-social behavior, as what I've said, by discussing the consequences of behaving pro-social manner, which should be positive, right? No? Or another one, I guess, is by discussing the negative consequences of not behaving in a pro-social manner. Again, all of these things that you are discussing should be sourced from the literature. So perhaps you can cite some references describing findings with regard to what are the consequences of acting pro-socially. And then after discussing the typical consequences of pro-social behavior, you will suggest that understanding what predicts it is important. And this gives way to the introduction of your predictor variable. But I suggest that you do not proceed directly to your predictor variable. You can identify a few candidate variables, possibly those that are known to predict the outcome variable in the literature. Some of this can be used as a control variable later on, and then eventually suggest your own proposed predictor variable. So in the case of the paper that we're trying to write, the outline proceeds to suggesting what are the things that can possibly predict pro-social behavior. So we can discuss some predictors of pro-social behavior according to literature, and then eventually segue into social capital. So, as what I've said, the next part of the outline is to suggest that social capital is an interesting predictor, and this can serve as a good transition to your next section, which is all about social capital, its definition, and its theoretical relationship with pro-social behavior. Again, I want to point out that when you write your outline, I suggest that you begin aspects of your outline with the verb, define, illustrate, describe, suggest. That way, not only do you know what topic you're going to talk about, but specifically how you're going to talk about it. So in the next section, after I have already kind of introduced what the predictor variable is, the next section would be to talk about the influence of the IV, or the predictor variable, to the DV. So in the hypothetical paper, this section can be labeled as the influence of social capital on pro-social behavior. So in this section, the first thing that we do is we define the IV, or the predictor variable. So define social capital, and then we discuss the typical consequences of the IV as a way of kind of defining and characterizing it as well. So in the outline, I said to illustrate, describe an individual who has social capital, and then describe the general positive outcomes of having social capital. Again, the things that you will need to put here are things that you cite from your references. And then eventually focus on the impact of the DV. So suggest about social capital's potential influence on pro-social behavior. So we're now at the part wherein we're trying to explain how social capital can influence pro-social behavior. And to do that, we would need a particular theory. This is very, very much ideal. So discuss a theory that potentially explains the relationship of the IV to the DV. And then explain the relationship of the IV and the DV using the theory you have discussed. So in the hypothetical paper, extensively discuss a theory that can possibly explain the relationship of social capital and pro-social behavior. I'm not exactly sure what theory this is, but I'm assuming that there is a theory that can explain this. So that is part of your task, to identify what theory explains the relationship between the IV and the DV. Argue for the relationship of the IV and the DV using the theory that you have discussed. So explain their relationship based on the assumptions of the theory. And then present empirical data, meaning to say findings from previous research that suggests that the IV does indeed predict the DV in the valence that you expect it to be based on the theory. However, present findings that are inconsistent with what the theory predicts. Establishing this inconsistency serves as an important justification for moderation. And this is kind of crucial. Narrative for the moderation may not need to establish this kind of inconsistency, but what I find is that that is really just kind of the strongest justification for proposing a moderation model. Like, if the relationship of the IV and the DV is consistent, then why would you suggest that this relationship would differ across different levels of another moderator? So it makes perfect sense that moderation is necessary when either two variables are expected to be related, but sometimes findings suggest that they're not, or they're related but in the opposite direction. Like, a theory suggests that they're positively related, but there are findings that suggest that they're negatively related. So that is an inconsistency. I guess another inconsistency would be if the two variables aren't supposed to be related, but in some findings they are related. So I guess that's another inconsistency. Although I feel that we won't find so many of those in the literature. So what would be more common would be two variables that are expected to be related, but empirical findings do not always suggest such. And that inconsistency serves as our research gap that justifies the proposal to examine a moderation model. So in the hypothetical paper, present empirical data that supports the idea that social capital positively predicts pro-social behavior. Likewise, present findings that contradicts what the theory predicts. No? So if we can find, or if we can establish that despite the theory suggesting that having social capital will lead to more pro-social behavior, to establish that inconsistency, it would be good if we can present findings that agree with that prediction, but also findings that suggest that having social capital has nothing to do with pro-social behavior. And then that inconsistency, again, justifies why we're looking at initiative as a potential moderator. Next, suggest that the inconsistency can be explained by a particular moderator variable. And this serves as a good transition to the next section. And in our hypothetical model, that variable is initiative. So, suggest that the inconsistency can be explained if the relationship is examined across people's level of initiative. So the relationship between social capital and pro-social behavior might be a function of one's initiative. That means to say that perhaps if I have social capital, yes, that will lead to more helping behaviors, but only if I have initiative. But even if I have social capital but I don't have initiative to help, then I might not help. So it kind of makes sense right now. And the introduction of initiative is a good transition to our next section, which is all about the moderator. So next, talk about the moderator and its role. So define the moderator. In our hypothetical research, we define initiative. Present and discuss extensively a theory that can explain the moderator's role. A theory that can explain how the IV's influence on the DV varies as a function of the level or category of the moderator. So present a theory that explains how initiative can moderate, particularly enhance, the relationship of social capital and pro-social behavior. When we say enhance, this means to say that the relationship between social capital and pro-social behavior is at its highest, strongest, when initiative is also high. Therefore, it has an enhancing effect. Present theoretical arguments for why and how the IV will influence the DV differently across different levels of the moderator. Arguments. You have to defend, you have to present your theoretical arguments. Present empirical evidence for this. Hopefully we can find some. And then after laying down your arguments, after presenting empirical evidence, then we can kind of loosely state our hypothesis, loosely state our prediction. So in our hypothetical research, theoretically explain why the relationship of social capital and pro-social behavior will be different across different levels of initiative. Particularly, we have to explain why we think that having social capital will lead to pro-social behavior only if there is initiative. But when there is less initiative or no initiative, even if somebody has a lot of social capital, that might not lead to pro-social behavior. So that is something that we have to defend and explain using the theory, of course, that we have presented a while ago. And then present empirical evidence. Hopefully we can find other research findings that suggests that pro-social behavior leads to more pro-social behavior, particularly for people who have higher initiative. And then loosely state that social capital can positively predict pro-social behavior, specifically when initiative in people are high. And then finally, the current study. So in our theoretical paper, we state the objective of the study. We remind the readers about the key theoretical arguments that we have presented. We state our hypothesis. Social capital will positively predict pro-social behavior. Initiative will enhance the relationship of social capital and pro-social behavior. And then we present kind of an overview of the expected contribution of the study. And then if you think that there are some important things to discuss about your methodological choices to test the hypothesis, so that can also be part of the current study. Okay, so that's a typical outline for the RRL for a moderation study. I hope that you learned something. Again, this is not necessarily a script or a template. No, this is kind of a suggestion to give you an idea on how to organize materials so that your literature review has a flow, has a narrative, has a story. So I hope that you learned something, and I hope that this is useful. If this has been useful, I want to invite everyone to please subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much. See you in the next video.